Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled.
They challenge us, these words do, to a higher discipleship and help us find the pathway to true happiness. But we're going to look at, first of all, the poverty principle. The poverty principle. And we'd say all poverty is bad. But here Jesus used some things that I think had to catch people's attention. Because in Jesus' day, it was just like today. I mean, wealth was what people regarded as the standard of happiness. How happy a person was dependent upon how wealthy he was or she was. But Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Now you may know that the record of this sermon, if it was indeed on the same occasion, Sermon on the Plain, it's called in the book of Luke, has blessed are the poor. And then woe to those who are rich. That was the other side of that. So what does that mean? What did Jesus mean by that? He did say here, blessed are the poor in spirit. Again, I believe Jesus said things more than once, and sometimes with a different slant on them, a different perspective, not contradictory at all. But I want to share with you, I think, what Jesus is saying here. First of all, about the purpose of that poverty principle. Well, God wants to bless us. We know that from what the Bible says. Proverbs 10:22, I believe, says, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow to it." Makes rich. Well, does that mean rich materially? Not necessarily. I mean, Jesus was not rich materially. Paul was not rich materially. Others who followed Christ, some have been impoverished according to this world standard of what defines wealth or poverty. I mean, how many people do you know that are living below the poverty level today that are believers in Jesus, who love Jesus? So it must mean more than what we think it means. I believe that what Jesus is saying is that sometimes we, in this world, we fall into that trap of measuring God's blessing in material ways. And so Jesus wanted to correct that. I'm sure we all remember the incident of the rich young ruler, how he came to Jesus one day and said, Lord, I want to be one of your disciples. I want to follow you wherever you go. And I want to enroll in your school of discipleship. Is what I think he was saying. And Jesus said something to him that was very important. He said, go. He says, have you kept the commandments? And he said, I have since my youth, or since I was a child, I think he said, because he's still a youth. He was like one of these young entrepreneurs, IT professionals today that found wealth at an early age. But Jesus said, one thing you lack. Go and sell what you have and give to the poor. And then take up your cross and follow me. Do we understand that Jesus is talking here more than in monetary means? But we are to be poor. Well, I'm not sure we are to be poor. But I think sometimes God makes us poor. And not necessarily in material things, but we have many who are struggling that way. Is God not concerned? Well, I'm sure when Jesus said this, he looked out over the crowd of people, probably several thousand people at least that were gathered there. And he saw many desperate faces, expressions on faces of people who were poor, who were dispirited. I think poor in spirit really means dispirited. Kind of desperate. Where do I turn? I mean, how many times have we seen that on the news? Maybe closer to home even. Of people that are dispirited. I've been watching this, the news. I'm kind of a news hound. And sometimes I just like to get away from the news, but I think it's important that we keep up with what's happening in the world. And so I watched this Sandy storm that hit the East Coast several months ago now. But people still dealing with that, very dispirited. I mean, have you seen a time that people are more dispirited than today? I don't know that I have. And this can be a great opportunity for people to listen to the words that Jesus is saying here. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But we talked about the people, the promise. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Until we recognize our spiritual poverty, we will never see true riches. I believe that's a statement that you can write down as true. I think it's true that the scriptures, until we recognize our spiritual poverty, we will never see true riches. It's what keeps people out of heaven. It's what kept that rich young ruler out of heaven. It wasn't his riches, but his trust in riches. Do you remember all the things that Jesus said about that? How hard it is for those who trust in riches to enter the kingdom of heaven. I mean, how many television programs have that theme to deal with, to get us to think, and our advertising, to get us to think, if I only could win the lottery. If I could only have I don't even need a few million, just 1 million would be enough. I'm not sure 1 million is enough today, but it's certainly not enough if that's all we're seeking out of this life. Do we want our heaven here, or do we want it when God ushers us in His presence? So there's a little bit in there about the poverty principle. I want us to think secondly about the adversity principle. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." What is the purpose of that? We all think, or not all of us maybe, but generally I would say we think that all sorrow is bad and to be avoided at all possible, if at all possible. But Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn." In Luke, in the parallel account in Luke, he spoke of those who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, he said, for you will mourn and weep. What is that saying to us? Is that saying that we should go around moping around with our head down and, always sad-faced? I remember an old comic strip called Sad Sack, about this sad sack soldier. Before I went in the Navy, I didn't understand it at the time, but I kind of understood it a little better after I went through the Navy. But I think sometimes we wear our emotions on our faces. And I'm sure when Jesus looked out at that crowd, he saw many people with sad faces, many people with tears in their eyes. Now, there's nothing wrong with being sad, weeping. There's nothing wrong, certainly, with weeping over a loved one, or weeping over a trial in our lives. And sometimes we wish that we could be giddy like other people. Have you ever wished that? Other people seem happier than you do. And you wonder, why, Lord? Why me? Nobody knows the trouble I see. Kind of attitude. I think that we can begin to think that way. Is that always bad? No, I don't think it's bad at all. Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. But I believe Jesus was also joyful. I think he had a great sense of humor. I mean, after all, if he's the creator, he created that sense of humor that we enjoy, that we need, that keeps us sometimes from becoming unglued. But there is a time to mourn. The book of Ecclesiastes tells us that. The wisest man before Jesus, Solomon, said there's a time to weep and a time to rejoice. So there are going to be these seasons. And maybe this purpose is to bring us to this one who is the man of sorrows. This one who is the comforter. Especially in our age, after Calvary, after the empty tomb and the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus back to heaven, he said he would send a comforter to be with us forever. So to bring us to that place where we will hear these words, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Does that resonate with you? Is there a kind of a mourning in your heart? Maybe for a loved one, maybe for a lost opportunity, maybe for wealth. We just spoke of wealth that is gone. Or we live in a mourning time. And it may be that people are more attuned to these words of Jesus now. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. It's our duty, our job, our privilege really, to take this good news to those who are mourning. the people, the promise. They will be comforted. The word comfort there is the noun form of the Greek word parakaleo, which is a verb. But there's a noun form. Jesus used it when he spoke of the comforter that would come. Paraclete is the Greek word. It means someone called alongside to comfort. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Jesus said, we're going to look a little further, and then I want to share a verse that Jesus said about the meek. He said, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So we've looked at the poverty principle, the adversity principle, and these are my terms. Here another term, the modesty principle. Now I think meekness could be understood as modesty. We're going to talk about that a little bit. The modesty principle. What is the purpose? Well, what does meekness mean? Well, I remember that word being used of Moses. Now, if we're inclined to think of meekness as weakness, then the image of Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments should dispel that. He doesn't seem to be a very meek person. I'm not sure Moses was like Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. I think he was much more modest. Well, Charlton Heston was a good choice. I like Charlton Heston. But meekness, I think it means here is a person who doesn't really think of himself or herself. Maybe doesn't think more highly than they ought. The Bible tells us not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. It also tells us to think of others before we think of ourselves. Well, more than Moses, I think of Jesus when I think of meekness. Do you remember when Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden? Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and lowly of heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls." So meek and lowly of heart. I mean, are these two sides of the same coin, perhaps? Maybe they're even the same meaning, meek and lowly of heart. Kind of the opposite of the Hollywood starlet today. I don't know, do they still call them starlets? I think they just call them stars. Kind of that self-made man, self-made woman. Kind of the, taking life by its horns, having it all. The successful person, we would say today, is not a meek person. You can't be meek in this dog-eat-dog world, we would say. But I want to suggest that there's a purpose in what Jesus said here. And I believe that purpose is to make us like Jesus, who is meek and lowly of heart. And meekness is not weakness if we understand and know the real Jesus. I mean, this was one who calmed the waves of the sea, who spoke a word and he stilled the waters. He raised Lazarus from the dead. He cast the money changers out of the temple, who were the worldlings and the greedy profiteers from that holy place. Well, that's the kind of meekness that we are to emulate. people. Moses was called the meekest man in all the world on the earth of his generation. I wonder if there's someone today that God considers the meekest of his generation. I don't know that we have that many meek people today, but it's something that we wouldn't aspire to. And I'm not sure that meekness is something that you would aspire to. But I think what Jesus is saying is God looks at things entirely differently from the way we look at things and people especially. God's values are sometimes diametrically opposed to our values. And what God is looking for is that meek heart that acknowledges Him, that bows humbly before Him, and that walks humbly with Him. So that's why I'm suggesting a modesty principle here for us. The promise is that they will inherit the earth. Now, did you notice the future tense of that? Doesn't mean that it's ours now, but we will inherit it. That's where faith comes in. I've studied, and I'm sure many of you have, the example of people like Abraham, who didn't even have a country. He went through this life, lived to be an old age, looked for a city which has foundations, the book of Hebrews said, but he really didn't find it in this life. But through faith, he inherited the promise of what Jesus said here. They shall inherit the earth. I've been reading about the Israelites going in and conquering the land of Canaan. And I think there are many wonderful lessons for us there. God has given us this world to possess, even though we may not own a portion of it, even though we may not be rich by this world's standards, even though we may not be one of the 100 most powerful people in our city or our nation even, certainly our nation or our world. But this is how God judges worth. Blessed are the meek, Jesus said, for they will inherit the earth. And then, finally, we're just going to look at the first four here. And then next week we'll have the final four. But blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, Jesus said, for they will be filled. So the poverty principle, the adversity principle, the modesty principle, and I want us to think about the integrity principle. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, Jesus said, for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now that word righteousness has a strange ring to our ears today. I mean, when's the last time you heard that used in an everyday sentence? I'm not talking about a Christian gathering like this, but out there somewhere in the workplace, for example. I mean, maybe people will talk about integrity. Integrity really doesn't. I mean, that's kind of our word there that we would use today, maybe. But righteousness just simply means being right. So if you prefer to just use the biblical term there, use righteousness. And what is righteousness? Well, again, being right with God. And I believe, too, right with men. Do you remember where the Gospel of Luke says that Jesus grew in stature, wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and men? So I think it means that we live a life of integrity, biblical integrity, where we seek to be right with God and right with our fellow man, fellow woman, fellow human being. So what is the purpose of this principle? Well, I believe it's to make us vessels of honor. Paul used that term, that phrase, in his letter to Timothy, second letter, chapter 2, verse 21. That we would be vessels of honor to God and to influence our generation toward righteousness. Now, I remember there's a verse that I like in the book of Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 34, where it says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Now, why is our nation so unrighteous? Why is our island here so unrighteous? Now, I'm not saying we're more unrighteous than other places. And I think we as Christians would say, well, it's because there's so many unrighteous people here. It's because there's so many people who don't really know God. But here Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Do we hunger and thirst for righteousness? For moral rectitude, to use another definition of that, I suppose. But it's more than just moral. It's spiritual rectitude, being right with God and being right with people, living the right life, a life that glorifies God. Who are the people? Well, he said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And we know that there's a lot of hunger and thirst in the world. But little of the kind that Jesus is speaking of here. Every generation has its Jobs and Noahs. I suppose we could say Mrs. Job and Mrs. Noah too. I think they were patient, certainly. I know Mrs. Job has gotten some bad press, but I think you know what I'm saying. It's not just men. God is looking for those who will hear these words of Jesus, hunger and thirst for righteousness. Do we yearn for righteousness, not just for our nation, but in our own lives? Are there areas of unrighteousness? I think we would all confess, oh yeah. There are areas of unrighteousness. There are habits in our lives that we've allowed to become habits that maybe we ought to think about as regards righteousness. Are they righteous? Are they leading us to live righteously before God and before people? And then the promise. They that hunger and thirst after righteousness will be filled.